Okay, great. So we're going to get started here shortly. We want to make sure that folks can see the screen, the PowerPoint. If you can see the PowerPoint, it should say PRISM Webinar Series, discussing race and racism in campus workplaces. So please let us know if you can see that. And if folks can see that, we'll begin here shortly. If you can see it, please let us know in the chat box. Yes, I can see the first one. All right. So good afternoon to everyone here. We are excited to bring you this conversation today. Yeah, this is a topic that my colleague and I are very much looking forward to talking with you about today. We put a lot of good thought into this conversation and into this topic. And without further ado, we'll begin. So we'll begin with some introductions here, and I'll toss it over to my colleague, Theo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Theo Fowles. My pronouns are he, him, his. I've been working in higher education spaces, nonprofit spaces, K-12 spaces for over the past decade. I'm really excited to join the webinar today just to talk about this issue of how we talk about race in various workplaces, but especially in the higher ed workplace. I think that's a really important conversation. I get the pleasure and luxury to be able to talk about race all the time because I work at a cultural center on campus. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what privilege that allows me to have in talking about an important issue like this.
Thank you, Theo. And folks, my name is Wilman A. Christian III. I am the director of PRISM. I work here in the USC Race and Equity Center. And for those who are unfamiliar with PRISM, PRISM is a new tool that we recently launched earlier in the winter. And it is a tool for racially diverse professionals in higher ed, those looking to work in those spaces and those who currently work in those spaces. I'm also a doctoral student here at the Rossiter School of Education. Currently studying race in higher education workplaces, looking at how racism in higher education workplaces works. I've been in higher ed for over 10 years, and I'm happy to talk with you about this subject with my colleague Theo here. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit more before we go into the presentation about PRISM. For those who are just joining us. So PRISM, as I mentioned, is a tool that we've recently launched. And PRISM has been launched to address a longstanding issue in the field that in our center's 11-year history that we noticed, right? Often we would go to campus and do campus climate research. And we would find that folks who are working there would often tell us that, there are not enough people of color working there. And when we'd investigate and ask why, they would often come up with excuses like, well, we just can't find them. There aren't enough of them. Yeah, they don't want to move here, so on and so forth. But in digging further, we also knew that those excuses weren't true, right? Look, color, who work on college campuses all the time, right? So we knew that there was an issue that we wanted to fix and address. And that is the underrepresentation of people of color hired into higher education, and in particular, certain positions of influence on college campuses, right? So wanting to rectify that issue, our team here did some good thinking about a tool that could be used to address that issue. And one of the areas that we want to pursue equity in is recruiting, right? So we do that through PRISM. PRISM is a tool that allows higher education entities to better recruit people of color, right? And some of the things that went into building PRISM and thinking through PRISM is that we noticed that there are hiring inequities throughout the industry, right? Some of those inequities occur by virtue of by outright bias and prejudice. There are also issues with the talent pipeline, recruitment and retention. Those are climate-induced issues. right? So it's just sometimes difficult to recruit people of color to college campuses because college campuses haven't done their own work in addressing campus climate issues. And if they don't address the campus climate issues, that often has implications for retention and advancement, so on and so forth. We also don't know much or don't keep good data on the trajectories of people of color, right? And kind of thinking through this, these are some of the things that undergird, the creation of PRISM and that are threaded through the platform. So if you're new to this experience and you're new to our work here, I definitely want you to check out PRISM, www.prismnetwork.org. On the platform, we'll be talking about issues like we'll be talking about today. There'll be additional resources to help college campuses become more equitable environments for people of color, as well as for professionals of color who work in higher education. What does advancing their career look like? We'll be offering tools and resources for that as well. So I'm gonna kick it over to you, Theo. Can you talk to us about what we'll be covering today?
Yes, so we're excited to, again, have you on today. But we'll cover a little bit of what we want to have in terms of impact today. We want to make sure that you know that this conversation is a conversation that has an immediate impact on a variety of stakeholders, from the students to the workforce. That includes faculty, staff, alums. Talking about race, again, can change the immediate culture of an organization, and that happens from top to bottom and in the middle as well. But that's only if the proper structures and time are given to the issue so that these processes can develop. And so, although the opportunity to change culture is a positive one, although it's often easy to say that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion platforms and opportunities happening on campus, the ability to talk about race is still a difficult one to have. And I think that when we get into the nuts and bolts of our conversation today, we'll find that the value of our stakeholder may often shift. From a higher ed perspective, a lot of times our focus is immediately, on the student as the end user. And we often forget about the folks working in the background, so your faculty and your staff. And so a lot of our conversations about how we talk about race is often about how our students are talking about race. And behind the scenes, there's still a water cooler that happens in the offices on campus. So we're going to talk about how can we, at those water coolers, whether that's the faculty water cooler, whether that's the staff water cooler, how can we really engage in those conversations that ultimately end up impacting the culture that the students experience on campus.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that's the overview. We'll be talking about those three big buckets. But we also know that we have education folks in here, right? So, for our learning objective folks, here's what we're going to be discussing in kind of like plain talk, right? We want to first kind of like explore and understand the significance of race. And thinking through this presentation, Theo and I, came to the conclusion that race is under-discussed in higher education workplaces. It happens in higher education workplaces, but it's under-discussed. But it's also significant, right? It has significant implications for one's advancement, what happens, one's experience in their workplaces, what even happens before that person gets to the workplaces. Racialized phenomena really shape a lot of the higher education workplace context, right? So we'll understand the significance race plays there, unpack that, explore that, and make meaning of that together. Secondarily, we want to introduce folks to the racial literacy concept. We'll introduce folks to this concept, unpack that, as well as begin to explore its applicability to the higher education workplace context, right? There are some things that the concept offers, that could be helpful to folks looking to advance equity in these spaces, and thinking through this topic, we came to understand that folks are on a different, everyone's on a different spectrum in terms of their racial literacy or where they are, and kind of grappling with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, right? So we want to offer a way to move folks who are not as well versed on these things, a way to advance, right, and become more well versed. And thirdly, we want to offer some practical suggestions and be able to help each other apply these concepts and think about what they look like in workplace context, right? So we'll begin exploring that towards the latter end of our presentation, right? So Theo, let's just
jump right into it.
Jump right into it. Talk to me about your experience in higher education, specifically thinking about your roles and some of the jobs that you've had in higher education, and why your challenges and successes also regarding discussing race and racism in those workplaces.
Yeah, so I think my background, again, is primarily within cultural center spaces. And so one of the things that has afforded me is the opportunity to talk about race every day that I come to work. A lot of times, I have the privilege of looking at everything through the lens of race, whether that's, from the music that is playing in the office to, the folks that happen to stop by the office. The folks that usually come to my office are the ones that want to engage, with my students, the Black students that are here on campus. And so it's very interesting because the challenges that I have in that space are whether people want to approach. There's a sense, as we talk about the spectrum of literacy, right? Sure. As people have a greater understanding of how race impacts our surroundings, the more comfortable they get with that idea, the more willing they've been able or willing to come to my office they have become, right? And so for me, another thing that's really interesting in my space is that students are constantly a part of my own environment, right? There are a lot of higher education spaces where they're not directly student facing,
right?
But in my position, I have to always remember that as we talk about these difficult conversations, that students literally are in my office or in the workspace. And so how I respond to issues of race and issues of intersection and issues of ism also reflects immediately back onto that direct, that end user that we spoke about a little bit earlier, which is, again, oftentimes that student. So, I think if we're thinking about other challenges, I think it's one thing I think is how to plug into a system like mine, right? So a lot of times, as a cultural center space, I might get a referral, right? A faculty or a staff member might get referred to my office. Hey, I heard you had resources to talk about race, and if you have them, I don't need to have them, right? Okay. And so I think that's another issue, is to take that onus off of each individual department or school.
So somewhat transactional.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. And I think that especially when you're talking about race, which race was a social construct, right?
Sure.
If you leave out that social portion and only end up with the transactional, I think that's a big gap that a lot of higher ed spaces have.
It's almost like someone saying, "Well, you're the race expert, so I'm just going to transfer this to you because it's too risky to deal with," right? Yeah. No, it's interesting because as I'm listening to you, some of the things that you mentioned in your career trajectory, I've also experienced, right? I'm thinking about times in my career history where I've been in workplaces and higher education workplaces where I was the only person of color, right? Interacting with students of color, hearing about their racialized experiences and the issues that they're facing in the classroom, in the campus, but yet also having to negotiate my position in that particular workplace? Can I talk about race? Well, my students of color who are experiencing this are telling me this, but my peers, colleagues, their receptivity to that, right? So there's this negotiation there that as a person of color, I was burdened with, I was tasked with, and sometimes I was frustrating, right? Because the social environment limited the way in which I could discuss race and be a racialized person in that place. So I'm thinking about that. I'm also thinking about, also similar to your career history, being able to be in a place and environment where race is frequently discussed and centered, right? And the implications of that. Yeah, so I'm thinking about this idea of difficulty, right? So let's unpack why it seems why it is that talking about race in higher education workplaces is so difficult. It's so fraught. Why don't people like to talk about race in higher education workplaces?
Yeah, let's unpack these suitcases, get all the baggage on the table.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the big issues, right, is that the way our society is structured, some people think that talking about race is divisive in and of itself, right? We should all be able to get along,
sure,
no matter what our intersections, which could be understandable, but having those difficult conversations could be seen as divisive. And some people just don't like to talk about race.
Yeah.
When you have the privilege to not have to think about race all of the time, it can be hard just to even think about being in someone else's shoes. And if you are willing to take those steps and put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you also don't want to step on any toes, right? You don't want to offend anybody. And so, the possibility of offense, you might want to stay away from that just to be on the safe side. And then there's other folks that think that I come from home, I go to work, and I go from work to home, and race doesn't have anything to do with what I do sitting behind the desk.
Yeah.
And so they separate their work self from their social self. That may or may not include race at all. And sometimes there's a worry that folks don't want the finger pointed at them.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to be an ist, whether that's a racist or any other ist. Right. I don't want that perception of hey, I wasn't quite sure what this process was like or what this thought was like, but if I get it wrong, I might be seen as an ist. And so I think that those are some big buckets, some big suitcases that people often carry with them.
I agree. Another thing that kind of shapes the discourse, you started to pick up on this idea of discourse of race, right? One of the things that often shapes the discourse of race are kind of like the local dynamics on a campus, right? And often the local dynamics or the current dynamics of how a campus engages in discourse on race has been shaped by the historical way or ways in which it has previously discussed race, right?
Or not
discussed race, right? So oftentimes we forget that there are cultures, right, that precede, people's employment around how a campus engages in race or does not engage in race. And oftentimes that culture is more prevalent than we would like to acknowledge, right? And it's, it manifests in ways as like, oh, we don't talk about that here, right? Oh, it may manifest in ways like, oh, you're being risky for, and those are kind of like coded languages, right? That help us understand how race is discussed, right? They give clues in the environment for how discourse on race is engaged, right?
That's correct.
In addition to that type of discourse, there also have been like outright legacies of how a campus has historically engaged issues of race, right? That permeate the work environment, right? So I'm thinking about our campuses, if they haven't asked themselves these questions, they may want to think about, like, in what ways has our campus, how did it advance civil rights or not, right? And how does that legacy play into how we think about employees of color in this place, right? Like doing the hard work of asking those questions. There are interesting ways in which all campuses have engaged in race, right? We think about, even different institutional types, right? And the ways that they were set up. For example, we may think about HBCUs, right? Who these institutions were created to educate former slaves, Black people, right? So there's a way in which race has been built into the environment there, right? We also think about ways in which race has been built into other types of environments and other types of research institutions. I'm specifically thinking about like ways in which like racialized research negatively was carried out on particular campuses, right? And what does that legacy say about people of color wanting to work there? Do people of color even know that, so on and so forth? I'm also thinking about like community colleges, right, who have a very localized understanding, or very critical understanding of their community, right, and the demographics of who their campus serves, right? And so there's a way in which they understand race and are attentive to those issues, right? So there's a way in which the campus ethos and social environment shapes the way that discourse is had and is talked about in our campus workplaces, right? And we can't ignore that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think just to tack on just a little there, oftentimes, campuses may be seen as social or academic.
Sure.
And a lot of times you need both,
right,
in order to address an issue like race on campus, right? And so I think that sometimes we end up being in cultures where we're good at one,
sure,
and not at the other,
right?
And then we find ourselves stuck and trying to figure out what to do next.
I agree. So let's kind of like think about some of the policy implications, or like implications of race within a work context, right? Let's think about how we can think about how race, the unsaid implications of race, and how that may impact policy.
Yeah, I think a recent real world example, if you just look at the NCAA and their recent backtrack on the Rich Paul rule. For those that don't know, there was a potential rule that was going to require agents to have a bachelor's degree in order to be a certified agent, along with some other materials. We know that several institutions, even outside of the sporting industry, have found that degrees weren't necessarily required to do the work. And so when you look at an industry like the sports industry, where a lot of players are folks of color, a lot of people that are in that space are looking for people to represent them. And a lot of times when you're looking for someone to represent you, you often see yourself.
Sure.
And so when you combine the fact that people of color are getting fewer degrees than the majority out there, combine that with the opportunity for them to be represented by someone that they might feel comfortable with,
right,
and looking like them, then you can see the challenge that this rule might bring.
Right.
And I think that that these rules sometimes are intended, but sometimes they're unintended.
Sure.
Right. And I think that that's something to point out as well. And so once that inequity was pointed out to the NCAA, they quickly retraced some of their steps and made sure that they were as accessible as possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that particular policy, it didn't have anything to do with performance, right? Like like I'm thinking about that policy, and I'm thinking about like what does having a bachelor's degree, if someone can do the job well, should having that credential or not. But these impact their ability to be hired, right? These are the things that we want to contend with, right? As we think about, employment, advancement, so on and so forth. And these are the conversations that some folks on campus are familiar having, but some folks are not. And so thus, we really want to begin talking about the importance of talking about race in higher education work context. We understand it is hard, it is difficult, but it's also very, very, very important. And there are at least three kind of big buckets here as to how we want to think about the importance and the reason for the importance of talking about race in workplace context. The three are climate, crises, and incongruence, right? So we'll talk through a bit of those. Theo, we mentioned earlier in the conversation about this idea of social climate and how that impacts the discourse on race, specifically in higher education workplaces. One of the things that we, were thinking through and that we noticed is that people bring their race and their racial baggage with them to their particular workplace. What this means is that there's no way in which people hang up once they walk through the doors of their racialized selves once they come into the workplace, right? What that means also is that there's a mixed bag of people who are low in racial literacy and high in racial literacy, right? Because of that, right, that means that there are ways in which the environment is influenced by people who are well-versed and people who are not as well-versed, right? So sometimes those two entities bump heads, and that influences the climate. But that's another reason, that's to say, that's a reason that we want to be keen on these issues, right? That's a reason that we want to know and be conversant in discussing race in the workplace, because these dynamics are going to happen, right? We know these dynamics are there, and we want to be keen observers, but also keen actors and skilled actors, which we'll get to later, right? Another reason is, in terms of the climate, is that the demographics of the United States have been and continuing to shift, right? So inevitably, if our workplaces are going to look different, and that difference is going to influence the climate, especially if your workplace hasn't been so keen on addressing these issues, or hasn't been so keen, those changing demographics, employment demographics, can affect the social fabric of a particular workplace. Anything you want to add there, Theo?
Yeah, I think, I had to write down, and, every time we talk about this issue, I think more and more, right? And I think that that's something that most institutions should keep in mind. The more you talk about something, the more people will have ideas, the more they'll grow and develop. And so, one of the things I thought was, in my experience now, I have the opportunity to create space and place for people to share their experiences, but also validate those experiences, right? And so as we talk about, levels of racial literacy, it's also a concept of validating one's own personal experience and being able to share that with others as well, which can be a sense of climate. Right? Can I? Is this the right place to even share this experience? Right? Do I trust the people around me to validate me in this experience?
Right, and that leads me to another point. The idea that people of color often suffer from racial fatigue, from carrying around this idea of can I, right? The onus is always placed on us to explain racial issues, so on and so forth. Another reason impacting the climate is, it's a socio-political climate. We need not ignore what's going on in our nation. There are incredibly racialized things going on that impact not only the environment beyond our institutions, but also the environment within our institutions. In addition, racial crises are frequent And in these racial crises on campus, leaders are often making missteps. So, that's an important reason to be racially literate, as well as kind of like being aware of talking about race. In addition, there's also this idea of incongruence between what universities say via their diversity, equity, and inclusion statements and the on-campus realities of people of color in the campus workforce. In addition, people of color on their campus they need to know, they have a right to know how a campus or their particular workplace context is grappling with and living out these ideals, right?
Yeah, I would say, does the action match the memo?
Absolutely. Right. And if not, right, is an institution prepared to address it? Mm-hmm. And there are consequences, right, for not grappling with these ideas, for not grappling with race. Some of them may include exclusion, quick non-contextual fixes. Mm-hmm. We often see that what we call like the Band-Aid approach, mm-hmm. right? Like not understanding the nuances and be attuned to the nuances of race in the workplace. And these are things that we want to avoid. Another reason to be keen on discussing race is the data, right? I think an important thing is being able to disaggregate data, understanding how different racial phenomena on a campus may affect different racial groups within your workforce differently. So we want to talk a little bit about data. Yep.
Yeah, so up until this point, we've given you some qualitative mm-hmm. examples. We know that stories make concepts easier for people to remember. But we did this more so for the fact that race is an abstract concept that's ironically hard to see and hard to grasp. And two, we wanted to engage folks in a time where diversity and equity have become buzzwords. Mm-hmm. Folks don't often understand that impact. And so one of the reasons that we are including this data, as you can see, is that folks can see the cumulative mm-hmm. Impact of race and racism in the higher education workforce. So a lot of times people might comment that, that was your experience, or it was a one-off experience, or I'm sorry that happened to you. But, looking at this data, you can literally see things from multiple viewpoints and make better decisions from there. So, for example, some people will say, "Oh, it wasn't a racial thing that I didn't get hired for this position. It's just that it wasn't a good fit, right?" And so we mm-hmm. can look at this actual data here in front of you and say, according to this data, there are a lot of people of color not fitting in, and so we can mm-hmm. Fill some of those gaps in order to make something different, make that environment different.
Yeah.
And I think that's where offerings like Prism really help to bridge those gaps.
Absolutely. Theo, can you quickly talk with us about like what potentially the implications of hiring a person of color on your campus in light of these data, right? So in light of a person of color being hired to a high position of influence, what are some of the inner workings on that particular campus? How might they look?
Yeah, I think if you think about the opportunities for top-down mm-hmm. Leadership, when I think about some of my mentors, they always say, good news goes down to the masses, bad news mm-hmm. goes up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think when people are looking up to their leadership, and they also see a reflection of themselves in that leadership, it will have a domino effect in terms of re-engaging communities that may not have been engaged.
Wow.
In the processes of the university, right?
Wow.
So, for example, if you're within student affairs and mm-hmm. and your top level folks end up being a person of color, then your affinity groups that you may or may not know about at the university will become more engaged.
Wow.
Your alumni base will click and see what's going on at the university because they see that reflection of themselves. Mm. Your students, again, oftentimes the most important stakeholder that we spend our most time on, they become re-engaged and say, hey, how did this person, what was their pathway?
Yeah.
And because I see them on this pathway, I can also take these different routes to success as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a big domino effect just in making sure or being cognizant of the opportunities that you have in selecting the right individual,
sure,
but also the individuals that fill these buckets.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because if I'm seeing all these things happen on a campus, right? If I'm seeing certain groups be more engaged, the question then becomes, how do I understand these things? What sense am I to make of these things, right? If I'm an employer or manager or a leader, and I'm seeing, okay, we hired this person. As a result of hiring this person, I'm seeing these things happen. Some groups are more engaged. Some folks are asking questions, right? How do I put all this together? And then what do I do with it, right? So that brings us to this idea of racial literacy.
Right.
And, it's kind of essentially what racial literacy is being able to read and accurately understand racialized phenomena as they occur, right? And we use Guinier's racial literacy framework to do that. It's understanding the structures, the practices, the hierarchies, and frames that shape a narrative, right? So there are at least 3 things that we want to make sure that we're doing, and 3 ways that we want to enter into this racial literacy conversation. It's very important, especially for folks, persons of color, but also non-persons of color, to be racially literate, right? And to do that, and to better understand this framework, and to begin employing this framework in your organization, there are at least 3 things suggested by Guinier that we must do, right? The first is directly discussing race. We kind of got at this early on in the presentation. We know that folks are reticent for many reasons to discuss a race. But one of the ways to do that, and I want to begin as we unpack this, I want to emphasize that it's a skill building. This is a capacity building. This is a skill building thing that we're getting at, right? It's not that like some people have racial literacy and some people don't. It's a skill that is cultivated and developed. And this is a skill that we must be continually doing in our workplaces, right? The first way we get there is directly tackling race, discussing it, entering into it, acknowledging it. The second thing here is acknowledging the psychological consequences of race and racism, right? Not just like discussing race we just don't want to discuss race and ignore that race has material and psychological, and also research shows physiological consequences, right? So what does it look like then for me as someone who's a leader in the workplace, in my higher education workforce, to acknowledge that? I might want to think about things like check-ins, and you'll get at some of the practical ways to do that, to address some of those psychological concerns that are caused by race and racism, right? That could be happening in that direct environment, workplace environment, or beyond, right? That workplace environment. Making racism visible and contemporarily and historically, right? We kind of got at that earlier, right? Like understanding that racism isn't something that happened and that doesn't happen anymore. But, as a leader, I'm to make sure that I understand how racism has happened and continues to happen, what structures support that, and embed that inequity on my campus and in my workforce. So, in bringing folks this framework, it's incredibly important for many reasons. Again, skill, and it's a big picture thinking. We'll begin to unpack some of that here. Let's talk about why developing racial literacy in the workforce is incredibly needed and important.
Yeah, so I think we started, in our previous conversations, we came up with this concept of big picture thinking, right?
Sure.
How does being racially literate and moving your understanding not only of your internal self, if you're a person of color,
Yeah.
right? And moving that forward, but also if you're not a person of color, how do you understand the broad strokes and how the impact happens, right?
Sure.
Big picture thinking. Being racially literate overall means that you're giving value to your own experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then also in doing that, you give validation to someone else's experience as well.
Sure.
I think what does this look like in the workplace? It could look like many different things, but
Sure.
I think in my experience, it looks first like affinity groups.
Mm-hmm.
Within the higher ed space, that they may come in the form of an alumni association. It could come in the form of a faculty assembly or a staff assembly,
Mm-hmm.
and breakout groups from those organizations. But more and more recently, we have these things in our pockets, and so we have affinity groups that are forming through group chats and messaging online platforms, whatever those platforms may be. They're opportunity for folks to come together.
Yeah.
And so a racially literate campus has two things going on. They know about they know about those affinity groups and they support those affinity groups.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely one thing,
right.
To really think about how to transfer those ideas into the workplace. But then you have other things as well. We can jump into those too.
Yeah. As you were talking, it it really highlights for me the idea of, again, understanding racial literacy as a skill, right? And how it helps us to appropriately interpret racialized language, the behaviors, artifacts, and stuff, right? Like folks that are not racially literate, may see these things, may observe these things, but may not have the right lenses to accurately interpret. You brought up a phenomenal idea when we were discussing this about how for folks of color, aggregating together, or kind of like self-aggregating and congregating, how that can be seen by some as separatists, or it could be seen or interpreted by some as no, people of color, this is what they do as a respite. So it's that type of thing, right? Again, better interpretations. We're thinking about disaggregated data, making sense of the data and not just taking data on its face value, to understand how different racial phenomena on a campus, and disaggregating data helps us to make more sound and better conclusions that could be used to rectify issues in our own campus workforce, right? Another point that you brought up, and I'll let you talk more on this because I want to hear more, is assisting with the heavy lifting, right? Can you talk to me about why it's important for leaders and actors in higher education organizations to be racially literate so they can be in a place to do that?
Well, I think one of the common terms that you hear now is having a seat at the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times the table is small, and so if you're sitting at a small table, you really need to understand a wide variety of people, a wide skill set of people, and a wide experience of people, so that those voices can be heard. I think that we talked earlier about racial fatigue and having to talk about issues over and over, and I think having opportunities for people to discuss race alleviates the opportunity for others to have to speak up all the time. If there's some understanding that you've had in speaking with coworkers and speaking to other stakeholders that you can speak to while sitting at that table, I think that is a win-win, not only for for you as a leader,
Yeah.
because it says that you value the folks within your network and your group, but it also provides some of that respite that we talked about, right?
Right.
A lot of times we're like, we feel like we're talking to each other, and it's like, man, it's not that I want to hear the sound of my own voice, but
right. I just need to get this off my
I
chest.
need to get this off my chest.
Right. That is an excellent point, because it goes back to one of the ways, according to Guinier's framework, we develop racial literacy, and that's by directly and openly discussing race. And might I add, also providing opportunity for others to do so, right? I think you brilliantly pointed out that good leaders in organizations see the opportunity, provide the space and the wherewithal to do that. And that's also a way, well, not directly, but it's also a way to acknowledge the psychological consequences of race, right? Because you're providing a space where people of color can just get things off their chest, right? So yeah, this sounds like a tall order, Theo. So talk to me more about some of your successes in doing this, and some of the practical implementation steps that folks who are thinking about this, that our audience who are thinking about, like, what can they take from this conversation to begin doing and moving their campus or workforce towards greater racial literacy?
Yeah, I think in building out frameworks where people can really engage in these difficult conversations, I always like to start with things that have easy access, right? And so, in our previous conversations, we thought about just the idea of using awareness months. A lot of people say, hey, I know that, for example, Black History Month is coming up. Let me go to the Black Cultural Center and see what they're doing. But the month itself is an opportunity for your office or your space to also engage in an issue and a concept that socially everybody has this general understanding that it's Black History Month. And we might be talking about some of these issues. And so taking advantage of opportunities where the conversations may already have a platform is thing number one. So, for leaders within higher ed, that might be, attending a conversation series that's done by a professor of color. Right. It might be as simple as hosting lunch with one of your student organizations that you might not normally have lunch with, right? It's these simple things that that say, one, I see you, and two, I'm willing to have the conversation, right? The other thing that I would say, a lot of campuses are doing things like common reads, right? So if you're not ready to talk about it just yet,
you can read about it.
You can literally be literate about it.
That's
and so you can read about the issue, and that will give you some foundation not only to understand, but to then prepare yourself to talk about the issues.
And I like that idea, because it allows one to enter the conversation in a more informed fashion, right? I suggest during the conversation doing some reading prior to engaging, like doing some real literacy, right? Read authors who may challenge your perspective. And I know some of this for some folks seems, either redundant or like low-hanging fruit, but like it could be very helpful for you to understand some of the ways that if you have a racially diverse workforce, some of the ways that your employees are grappling with and understanding these issues, while also setting these issues in a historical context, right? So that you will be better able to support them and create a better environment for your campus or potential workforce. So actually do some reading. It's
amazing what can be found in books.
Yes. Are there other suggestions, Theo, you have for implementation and what this could look like?
Well, I think some things that are really simple that I've done in the past, just to show different points of awareness, right? I think about email signatures and what quotes may or may not be at the end of my email signature.
Yeah.
Right. I can change those simply to provide a message to those that I'd like to support, those that I want to be seen, and say, hey, I do know about this author, I do know about this concept, and I think it's important to the collective vision of this area, right? I think that that's important. I also think that that being supportive online is really a really easy way to show that you support. And so I think that in a time when students, faculty, and staff are all on social media, whether that's Twitter, whether that's Instagram or another platform, what is your area of reposting, right? Are you reposting that information from a cultural center? Are you supporting tweets or information from your faculty of color? All of those small things that seem minuscule as you tap, like or give hearts to, all those things show that you have some frame of reference for this literacy.
Yeah, and they can be seen, right? So if I am even if I might not know where you stand on particular issues, I at least see that you have an openness. If I'm following you on Instagram or following you on Twitter, I might not totally agree with or totally embrace your positionality or understand your positionality, but at least there's something there. There's an implication there that says at least this person, there's a potential openness, right? And because there's a potential openness, I could feel better about being in this workplace, discussing these issues with my colleagues, employers, so on and so forth, right? I like that idea of visibility beyond just the environment, the immediate workplace context, right? Because so much of what we do has implications within, but also
outside of space.
Exactly, absolutely. One thing you brought up was this idea of passive versus intentional training. I do like that. Our research center here is engaged in myriad ways to help folks work on these particular issues. Again, I can't understate I just can't overstate enough how many times that we get calls because of racial missteps, how many times racial crises could have been averted had folks had good racial learning, organizational training, so forth, and engage critically in these issues. Again, our research center provides myriad ways to do that, one of which is through our equity institutes. Another way, if you want to discuss these issues in a higher education workplace context, is through PRISM. We'll be offering more resources for your particular campus to engage these types of issues.
I think to tack on to that too, the concept is to often be proactive as well, right?
Right. Yeah.
Don't
absolutely.
Don't wait till the misstep happens. I think that the more racially literate you become, the easier it is to
diagnose
some of the barriers or the holes that you might have ended up stepping into.
Right. And avoid those.
If you hadn't had discussions.
That's a really good insight, because the idea of racial literacy is being able to see, but also foresee, right? And not be surprised by issues, to foresee potential challenges, remediate those challenges, address them, while also making the environment better for the people of color who already work there. Not being racially literate, it contributes to the problem because you don't see problems, right? Or you only see problems when they're face to face instead of afar off. So, it looks like we are right up on time. I am going to go a little bit over because, of the presentation malfunction, the technological malfunction. I do want to open the floor for questions. We really do appreciate you joining us today, but I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. And it looks like one here. Are are they going to give us slides? Yeah, we'll make the slides available as well as the sources. In terms of sources, where this data came from, their ACE data 2017 on college presidents. There's also 2016 data taking the measure of faculty diversity, as well as the digestive education statistics. Yeah, so we know that there are more data points, but these are some of the data points or data sources that we drew from in this presentation. Yep, we answered the slides. Any other questions, comments? We'd love to hear from you. We have a little bit of time to. Will this webinar be available to view again? One of the things that we're thinking about is, making these more widely accessible. We'll have to do a little bit of editing, especially with the technical malfunction. But we want to make sure that these are in a format that our folks are, can easily see, and that they are free of any issues. Let's see here, are behind. Bible. Are they no longer allowing silence as an option? As an academic, we have to theorize this concept and try to talk with the masses with data. It comes from research, so disengage in the masses.
So
you want to tackle that?
If we scroll up,
yeah.
So I think there's a comment from Destiny. Thank you for your comment there, in terms of higher ed institutions being behind. I think we may have poked a little bit in there, didn't go all the way down deep, but I think for me, it's a concept of that social structure,
sure,
versus the academia, right? And I think that academic institutions are really transactional. I think institutions that have incorporated that social dynamic within their campus culture are farther along in terms of making sure that these issues are addressed. I think that if higher ed leaders are aware of how students are responding to faculty of color, how faculty of color are responding to other admins, then you have this circular dynamic where these issues can be left out. If those social dynamics aren't in place, I think that's where you see us falling behind as institutions in terms of not being able to claim space and place for the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with this observation, right? Like, I think the idea is, as Destiny so very poignantly brought up, is that the dynamics and the demographics are changing, right? So we as institutions need to take a step back to take steps forward, in the sense of, and I don't want to say like a big step back, but there is a sense in which we need to think about, oh, yes, to acknowledge that, we weren't thinking this way previously, or these were some errors in our thinking that have prolonged inequities. And once we have acknowledged that, I think that there's doing the hard work of thinking about how do we, now acknowledging that, how do we lead and do better in light of the changing demographics and dynamics. It's a both and. I think, it's both acknowledging, taking a step back, making sense of that, but also moving forward in intentional ways as communities who have been underserved, communities who have been disadvantaged intentionally, are now making their way onto campuses. We need to make sure that we have the right stuff in place to serve them well.
I think that point of intention is really important. I know that there's many institutions that are using really big buckets, first generation or student of color, that those buckets are so big that they may not hit the specific demographic that you want. So and making sure that you're intentional in how you address each demographic.
I like that. Something that has not often, or something that has not been said, is challenging organizations to be race forward. There's a way in which these big buckets can obscure talking about race, and often do obscure talking about race. Not to say that anything is wrong with the buckets, but if we don't drill down to the racial implications, because you can talk about first generation students without talking about who those first generation students are. There are ways of talking about things without, talking about race. So we want to make sure that as organizations, we're being race forward. Are there other resources with regards to other isms, literacy? Yes, there are, myriad resources, intersectional resources. I would say there are a lot of resources. Talking about these different intersections. One way is as a campus that that you can engage with is through our Learning and Equity Institutes. They provide myriad literature on in different topics and ways of leading as an organization on these different topics. What quick tips do you have for people who are often the only person of color or few who are asked to champion the facilitation of racial literacy? Is a quick tip. It can be absolutely is. It is absolutely okay and encouraged to take a step back.
I think
full stop. That's all that needs to be said.
I think if I tackle this comment from Tiffany as well as from Reggie in terms of how to address senior leadership, I think both can be addressed in using the group model.
Sure,
right?
Absolutely.
If you're one of a few, make sure that you create the space and place where you're at some points in a collective. Right. And I think that if we learn anything from students, when the students band together,
that's
then the university answers, right?
Sure.
So I think that that concept works other places as well. So if you're feeling tired, if you don't think that your senior level admins are listening to you as an individual, really take some time to come together as a collective and say, hey, these are our collective experiences on top of here's some data.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Another strategy is to say campuses like to look good. Campuses play off of this idea of prestige, and prestige is there are kind of like many different facets to prestige, right? So if there is a way that you can say XYZ leader at XYZ institution is leading on this issue, and we're not, as a result of not leading on this issue, what does that say about our campus? People will listen. I think that in terms of senior leadership, engaging them in experiences and tools that have credibility. We have at this university some amazing research centers, Center for Social Justice, the Center for Urban Education, the Race and Equity Center here, who are doing work in these areas with senior leadership of different institutional types to get them to begin broadening, deepening, advancing their racial literacy, right? We have expertise and experience, right? So connecting with us and connecting with other organizations to help them engage, racial literacy and how it can be better. The campus environment can be improved as a result of that. And not just at the top level, but we want to make sure that racial literacy is threaded throughout all the campus environment, right? And that it gets down to different organizations, so on and so forth.
Any last questions?
Two more. We'll take two more questions.
Two more questions. Yeah.
Okay. So Tiffany, it's our pleasure to bring this conversation to you and others. This is something that we think often about and have been engaged in. So we just want to, continue to bring others into the conversation, right? Safeguards for job loss, fear of being overlooked for promotions. You recommend for people who are doing this work on campus and hold that respect? Yeah, that is a, Destiny, that's a really interesting question. The researcher in me appreciates that question, because that's actually like what I'm studying and doing a dissertation on. Like, I know that there are ways in which the things that you bring up are very real and material consequences of discussing race and trying to hold people accountable for race. I would say that there's safety in numbers, there's that.
But I would also posit that, since we're talking about space and place, we're at large institutions,
Sure.
right? And so maybe your space or place at the university right now isn't where they're going to move the fastest on this issue.
Sure.
And I've learned that my work is bigger than just my individual office. And
Sure.
so if I can take some of my concepts to another space and place within the university, I'm willing to look at how those collaborations can happen, right? And I think that a lot of times when we are looking at a singular organizational structure, we're not often looking to the left and right and saying, how else does this play out, within the university?
Yeah, I think that's a really, 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 really good point, Theo. I think just having, I call it like the sonar effect, right? Where you're, and we've talked about this, like how when you bring up different concepts on to, especially racial equity concepts, to different audiences on your campus, gauge how they're receiving that, right? And that should tell you something about that environment, right? Their additional receptivity to or not, but that should in some ways inform how you continue to navigate that on your environment or in your particular workplace, where to step and where not to step, and also recognizing that that places where you may be encouraged not to step in terms of race may still need some work. So the thinking then becomes like, who are my my allies in that space, right? Like, so there, I would say that there's always strategy and negotiation. Unfortunately, that has to happen for people of color because, and it shouldn't be this way. And I'm not saying that that, but that there's a strategy and negotiation that happens in terms of pushing racial equity forward on a campus.
And I think I mean, just to have a final thought on this, I mean, one of the easiest ways to safeguard yourself is to write everything down, right?
This is very, very practical.
You have to have receipts, right? And so whether that's email documentation for yourself or a Google Doc that you keep of, hey, this is my this is the goal, or this is what I'm working toward, and this has been the responses, right? I think in this day and age, I think most people are used to the idea of, hey, my data or my experience can be known with just one click. It's okay to keep track of what's been going on.
Might I also add this? There are ways to advance racial equity outside of your organization, which is a safe way to do that. Writing articles, blog posts. So the work continues beyond that, right? And might I add, that may even get you to another position or on another campus that better positions you to advance racial equity and hold others accountable. So there's also that. So
the big picture.
The big picture thinking. Well, friends, we sincerely appreciate you hanging with us throughout the technical difficulties. This was an amazing conversation, and we really appreciate your time today. Any final thoughts, Theo?
No, I think that at the end of the day, these are conversations that need to be had, and that we're all growing in the conversation, and we just want to make sure that the conversation is being had. So thank you.
Thank you again. www.prismnetwork.org. If you are looking for jobs or want to, post your CV, join it. If you are an institution looking to advance racial equity on your particular campus, subscribe or email me. I'll be more than glad to talk with you about PRISM. And I'll put here my email address if you need to get in contact with me.
content. You got to do.
Oh, yeah, public.
Yep.
And last question, is there a date for the next webinar? We will make sure, if you haven't done so already, to email me or join our listserv. If you got today's link, you are most likely on our listserv. But we'll be announcing our other resources that are forthcoming. Also, feel free to email us if there are topics or resources that you in the field need concerning higher education and workforce equity. We'd love to have folks who are part of the PRISM network think with us about what we could offer. But yeah, in terms of announcing webinars and additional resources that will drop, make sure you're on the listserv and we will notify you. Thank you again for your time today. It was a pleasure. We'll be talking with you soon.